Hi, I'm Linda Mal, and welcome to Art This Week. On this week's episode, we visit the Kimbell Art Museum, and our interviewer, Aimee Cardoso, speaks with curator George Shackelford about the exhibition, A Modern Vision, European Masterworks from the Phillips Collection. Now for Art This Week.
Hi, I'm here with Deputy Director George Shackelford at the Kimbell Art Museum to talk about their new exhibition, A Modern Vision, the Phillips Collection. Thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be here.
So we're probably in one of the, arguably the most important modern art collections.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about what is in the collection?
Duncan Phillips began collecting in the teens, the 19-teens, essentially 100 years ago, and he was very interested in, at that point, in classic modern art. He was interested in the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists, but he got bitten by the contemporary art bug. And by 1921, when he founded the Phillips Memorial Gallery as America's first museum of modern art, he had begun to acquire works that were almost immediately hot off the easel. He collected broadly in American and European art, again from probably the 1850s to about 1955, 1960. He dies in 1966, and it's a collection that then spans that sort of decade, that century, in a great encyclopedic way, but with a very particular focus on works that were very brushy, intensely colorful, and that really exuded the artist's spirit.
And this work focuses specifically on the European works.
That's right.
But he has other works by a lot of American artists.
That's right. He was led often into discovering European artists through his friends who were American artists. His wife was an artist. He was friends with Arthur Dove, John Marin, George O'Keeffe. They helped him understand artists like Kandinsky. He eventually discovered on his own Georges Braque and Pierre Bonnard, who were probably the two artists he loved the best.
Tell me about the family. You mentioned that initially this started off as a memorial.
That's right. Duncan Phillips' mother was a member of the Laughlin family from Pittsburgh, which was a very good thing to be. They were big in steel. And his family had moved to Washington in the 1890s, and they lived in this beautiful house, still existing. It was there that he began to collect. And his father and brother died, and he and his mother decided to open the collection as a memorial gallery to the father and brother. From then it took off, and that was in the late teens, and it opened in 1921, and by the time Phillips died in 1966, the collection had far outgrown the original house and had moved into an annex building, and that building has been enlarged, and yet another building has been added to the collection, so that in what is nearly its centennial year, it has taken over a wonderful corner of Washington. It's just one of the great museums in America.
So it started off in his house in
That's right.
DuPont Circle.
That's right.
And was there a reason why he did this? You know, I know you said the memorial, but why didn't he choose to put the work somewhere else and he continued to live in that home? Well,
I think they initially thought that it would be something that would be open episodically.
Okay.
And wouldn't necessarily be the public institution that it grew into being. They were still living at home. They lived in the house. They would open it up. There was a gallery addition. But then as the collection grew, it was clear that the collection had to inhabit the house.
Right.
And that they needed to move out. So the Phillips family moved to a new house. They opened the original building, and all of the rooms that had been bedrooms and living rooms and dining rooms became galleries. But they had, and they still have today, an enormous sense of intimacy because they were the size that your normal rooms are. It wasn't like going into a big institution. It was really like going into someone's home and seeing the great art that they lived with. Things would move, they would change, they would be in fluctuation all the time. And they were always, as Duncan Phillips said, it was an experiment station. That his home and the collection was a place to experiment with relationships between works of art and with learning what the newest thing was, or what a new energy between one old thing and one new thing might in fact turn out to be. As the collection grew, it became much more institutional and much more, if you will, a professional museum. It still, however, has the sense of being a family. In a way, I like to compare it to the Kimbell, because the Kimbell Art Museum was really conceived as being a very intimate space, a place where you would feel at home going into the building, and that's the same spirit that you have when you go into the Phillips Collection.
My next question was going to be about, the intimacy and the spacing of the rooms, and you actually interned there in the 70s, if I remember correctly.
That's right, yeah.
So how did that help in curating this exhibition and keeping that same intimacy in this building?
Well, in the Renzo Piano building here, we have an opportunity to make spaces as little or as big as we choose, and while we don't want spaces to be so small that they'll be crowded ever, because we hope we'll have big crowds for the run of this show. I wanted them to have a sense that you could come in and have a small experience, even if you're in a larger room. So here in this room, there is a wall full of Kandinsky, a wall full of Bonnard just behind us, and a wall full of Picasso to the other side. And so each of these becomes almost a little exhibition of its own. And by just looking at 3 things or 4 things, you get a sense of how this artist developed, but also how one owner owned these things, and what would he and his wife have seen as they had them and arranged them and lived with them in different ways. And so I hope it'll have a sense of being still a very intimate thing, even though we're in a rather grand building.
And I read that he would often, juxtapose artists of different styles in the same space to converse with each other. And I noticed here it's essentially more of kind of chronological, but like you say, you have artists grouped together.
Yes.
And he was also a writer. So what was he working through in these? What was he trying to find? And as he was learning more about the collection, what do you think was some of his favorite works from that?
I think that there are certain favorites that always came to the fore. Some of his old masters, as he called them, were amongst the sort of hallmark paintings in his collection. Here there's a great painting by Chardin that he bought in the 1920s that had been painted in the 1720s. And he looked on it as one of the sort of cornerstone paintings out of which both Cézanne and then out of Cézanne, Braque would grow. And one of the things we've done in this show is to put those 3 paintings on a wall together, or put paintings by those 3 artists: Chardin, Morandi, the great still life painter in Italy, Braque, and Cézanne. And to give a sense of how these artists had a kind of a give and take and a flow that try to get ourselves a little bit inside the mindset of Duncan Phillips. You'll be obliged to do some of that thinking on your own as you go through the collection and remember, oh, this reminds me of something I saw in the previous room. And I hope that you'll have those experiences as you're exploring the show. But in Phillips's own day and in his own home, and when he had absolute liberty with however he wanted to arrange things, you might have found a painting by the American Impressionist John Twachtman of a pool in Yellowstone hanging next to a painting by Degas of ballet dancers in Paris. But because the blue and pink colors were similar in both paintings, Phillips would be experimenting with that idea of how 2 paintings that have nothing to do with each other yet might have something to do with each other.
Finding those connections.
Yes, finding a connection. And I think you'll find that as you go through the show.
He talks about how it's really important for him to stress the continuity between past and present, and he essentially calls his museum kind of the American Prado. How do you think this collection and this show does that?
I think when you see the works that he bought by artists from the early part of the 19th century, from let's say before 1870, which include works by Sisley, Cézanne, Daumier, Manet, Corot, Delacroix, you'll see that he was buying things by artists who were already considered the modern masters at the period that he was buying them. And he bought those things and then would let them sing with the artists who actually had admired these figures a lot themselves. You know, so the late work of Monet from the 1890s, you know, looks back to the kind of luminous painting of Corot in the early 1800s, or an artist like Van Gogh or Seurat were intensely interested in the colorism of Delacroix in the early part of the century. So you have these historical connections that make a lot of sense. You'll experience some of that. Some of that you may need to read up in the catalog and read the wall labels to understand if you're not a real art historical buff. Yeah, and but I think you'll come to see that there are certain things that certain tastes that come out again and again. I'm sitting here looking over your shoulder at a painting by Kandinsky, and I'm reminded of how much it looks like the painting by Delacroix. And yet they're painted, you know, 70 years apart, and one has nothing to do with each other. And yet, because they were owned by the same historical figure, they may have something to do in his mind with each other.
We're sitting in front of one of Bonnard's great works, and he's one of the great modern colorists.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about this painting, in particular the palm, and what may have drawn Phillips to this painting?
Well, I think as you look at it in detail, it's just a masterful manipulation of color, and it's particularly wonderful for the way in which he balances cool with warm. The figure, the protagonist of the painting, is his wife Martha, who is seated in the very foreground, but almost as if falling out of the bottom of the painting. You know, she's the nominal figural presence in the picture, and she's in a kind of lilac blue shadow. But then just beyond her, the subject of the painting, in spite of its being called the palm, is really sunlight. And the reflection of sunlight, bright Mediterranean sunlight, off of the multifaceted canted roofs, tile roofs, and walls of a village laid out on the hillside below the painter, and then it's framed by this cool green palm above. So the green palm above, the blue shadows below, these cool colors inframe this brilliant hot sunset center. And so that mastery of balancing those color forces is what makes this painting, I think, so special. I know that it was very special to Mrs. Phillips, because when I was an intern at the Phillips Collection back in the 70s, Mrs. Phillips was still living, and the painting often lived at her house, not just at the Phillips Collection, but often back at her home, and it would make an appearance at the Phillips Collection from time to time, and people were excited to see it, because it wasn't something that was always there. Now, of course, it's always at the Phillips Collection unless it's here in Fort Worth, and I think it's one of the most special paintings. But because it had that early history of being more private within this public collection. It's not as famous as The Woman with the Dog, perhaps, or The Open Window, but for me, it's the one I'd make a lot of room for in my home if I could.
And he has 17 Bonnard.
Has 17 paintings by Bonnard, exactly. 13 paintings by Klee, a large number of paintings by Daumier, by Nicolas de Staël, by Braque, a huge number of paintings by Braque. And he loved these artists. In addition to the American artists he collected in depth, Prendergast, Dove, O'Keeffe, Marin, the artists of the sort of Stieglitz circle, which included in a way Kandinsky as well. So there's affinity all the way across this collection historically.
So we're standing in front of Braque's The Round Table. Now, the Phillips Collection was the first museum to acquire a Braque. Can you tell us a little bit about their relationship? Well,
Duncan Phillips and Georges Braque knew each other, and they had a relationship that extended from the 1930s all the way until the end of Phillips' life. And when he bought the last, actually, after Braque's death, he bought the last of his paintings in the last year of his own life. So that for Phillips, Brock was one of the artists who he saw as one of the great, great painters of the 20th century. He liked him a lot more than he liked Picasso, who was Brock's founder, co-founder of Cubism, and sometime rival in a way. But though Picasso has in history been given more weight than Brock, it was, in Phillips' mind, it was Brock who was the greater artist. And when you stand here and look at this painting of this tabletop still life, and you sense how right he was to admire Brock as a painter. The surface of this painting is among the most beautiful in this whole exhibition. It's got this beautiful fresco-like, very dry surface. You notice that it almost looks like stone, and it's just an extraordinary achievement. The scale of it is wonderful. I mean, it really is a painting of great weight and magnificence in this gallery.
And how many works by Brock does he have in the collection?
He owned 11 works by Brock over the course of some 45 years of collecting, and it's really it's fantastic to have so many of them. There's 7 here in this exhibition, so it's really a great investigation, a sort of mini show of Brock within this show.
And if I remember correctly, the museum was the first to have a show at the museum.
That's right,
Brock in America.
Brock. The first Brock show in America happened at the Phillips Collection as well, and in the 1930s. And that's true of many artists who are in this exhibition: Soutine, Ben Nicholson, Henry Moore, Brock, and they all received their first American museum exhibition, not at MoMA, not in Philadelphia or Washington at the National Gallery, which didn't exist till the 1940s, or at the Metropolitan Museum of Art or at the Whitney in New York. It was all of these happened at the Phillips Collection.
So how did the organization of the show come together? How did the Kimbell and the Phillips, decide to create this great show?
Well, it's a happy moment for us because the original mansion of the Phillips Collection is being renovated to have better climate control and better sort of infrastructure. And so the paintings needed a home, and we were very happy to give them a home for the summer. So here they are, 75 works of art from the Phillips Collection on view here until August 14th.
And I'm sure you're very excited since you once saw them in the home and now they're here in the Kimbell's home.
It's a really interesting and very different experience, but equally beautiful in both places.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
We want to thank George for speaking with us. For more information on the exhibition, go to kimbellart.org. That's it for Art This Week. Thanks for watching.
I still got your Polaroid.